Welcome to this tutorial on the use of the Contextual Assessment Framework designed by the University of Bedfordshire. Over recent years, we have worked with practitioners in a number of local sites across England to support them in identifying the best approach for managing their response to cases where young people have displayed harmful sexual behaviour, particularly where these cases have been no further actioned by criminal justice agencies and where young people are harming others in groups. In these cases, services are often struggling to engage young people in services. Young people have not admitted that they have sexually harmed a peer, and in the absence of a criminal justice response, multi-agency safeguarding partnerships are often struggling to identify how best to develop their response. When young people are harming their peers on their own or have been convicted of offences related to harmful sexual behaviour, sites appear relatively clear about how they should respond. But this clarity is often lacking in cases where no further action has been taken. Services cannot engage young people in interventions, or young people have been committing these acts in groups. When we set about to design an approach to support practice in this area, we worked with one site who had started to pilot a meeting where they would plan their response to no further action cases of harmful sexual behaviour. We observed these multi-agency meetings and reviewed the minutes of them, and used this to provide a foundation for designing a table. This table is the assessment framework. The table is intended to guide and minute meetings where plans are made about action to be taken in relation to young people who display harmful sexual behaviour. And the principles of these meetings and the original terms of reference can be found in the local site report that we published in 2016, documenting all of our work to support local practice in response to peer-on-peer abuse. These meetings can take a number of forms. Some are referred to as multi-agency planning meetings, others as harmful sexual behaviour surgeries, others as case meetings, strategy meetings. The name of the meeting is less important. The principle of it is central to understanding why people have come together, and so it's important for any site using this framework to agree the meetings in which it will be used and how it will be used in order to develop the local response to young people who display harmful sexual behaviours. Before taking you through the tool and how to use it, it's important to note its purpose. This table is not an assessment tool. It does not weight levels of risk or vulnerability, and it is not intended to do so. It can actually be used alongside existing assessment tools that have been designed for harmful sexual behaviours, such as AIM2 or Eraser, to help plan practice responses to identified risks, strengths, resilience factors and vulnerabilities identified in those assessment tools. But in and of itself, it is not an assessment tool. Its primary goal is to provide a framework for documenting discussions and holding meetings, and particularly for documenting the contextual as well as the familial and individual risk and resilience factors that have been associated with harmful sexual behaviour. And by contextual, we mean factors in young people's peer groups, school and other educational environments, and public settings in where young people are spending their time. The other goal of the framework is to chart previous and planned activity that can be conducted in relation to those contextual, familial and individual factors. So you're almost mapping out what you've done previously, what you intend to do to date, related to the concerns and strengths that have been identified. So, if during a meeting a number of risks are identified in a young person's peer group, but all of the planned activity is focused on their families, professionals can quickly identify a potential mismatch in their response and amend it accordingly. Engaging with the contextual dynamics associated to young people's harmful sexual behaviours also provides opportunities for practitioners to change the social conditions and social factors in which young people are harming others. And this is particularly important for services that are struggling to engage individual young people in interventions. So they may not be able to engage this young person at a given time in an intervention designed to address their harmful attitudes towards sex and relationships, for example, but they may be able to identify a route through which to engage that young person's wider peer group in diversionary activities through which discussions on relationships can occur, and in that sense create a peer dynamic that encourages positive attitudes about relationships and sex, and by proxy inform the attitudes and beliefs of the individual that they had concerns about. So for young people that have been subject to no further action decisions related to harmful sexual behaviour, there may be more potential in intervening with the social conditions and contextual dynamics of what they're doing than in engaging them as individuals in services, particularly when they've not admitted that anything has occurred. So, now we've outlined the purpose of the tool, it's important to think through how we use it. The tool is intended to be used to chart discussions and planned interventions. So it's helpful to use it before professionals come together to meet, during a meeting, and afterwards. In terms of prior to a meeting, it's helpful for practitioners to have collated information that is relevant to the tool and to have populated it as best as possible. And we'll talk about population in a moment. So that what's discussed during a meeting is the information that has been documented on the framework and anything that practitioners feel they need to add given the conversations that have happened. And after the meeting, activity that's been agreed in the tool can be tracked and amended, as well as any factors that may shift in terms of risk factors or identified strengths. We would also recommend using Simon Hackett's continuum of sexual behaviours to identify the nature of the behaviour being discussed in the meeting. Is the behaviour problematic or inappropriate, or is it abusive or violent? And this link can take you directly to that framework in order for you to use it as part of your meetings in this regard. We would recommend circulating this table in advance of meetings to professionals who have listened and engaged with this tutorial to ensure that the table is completed accurately and to provide further guidance on the reason that this is happening prior to any meeting. So, we've identified the purpose of this tool and given a general overview on how it's to be used. It's now important to take you through it column by column to help you really understand the best way to complete it prior to, during and after a meeting. So, as you can see, the overall template running down the side are the individual and contextual factors to be considered. So there is a row designated to individual factors, individual characteristics of the young person, characteristics related to their home and family, to their peer group, to their school and to their neighbourhood. And running along the top, you have this general structure that we would think a meeting would go through. So, firstly, a discussion about the young person's current situation. Secondly, a particular discussion about the harmful sexual behaviour that's being displayed. Then, consideration of vulnerability factors, risk factors, resilience factors, and strengths. And then a discussion about the professional involvement to date with this case, any planned actions or interventions as a result of the meeting, and any anticipated or experienced challenges and barriers to intervention. There's also a box in the top corner that can be completed to log whether this is an offence that a young person seems to have committed on their own, or whether they are harmful sexual behaviours that a young person seems to be displaying within a group, or both. And that's important because if it's a group-based behaviour, it may trigger the need for a wider discussion about other individual young people in that group, or to link these documents once they've been collated for all individuals connected to the same group. So I'm going to take you through this table column by column, but bearing in mind the rows that are running along down the side. So let's look at column 1. This is about the young person's situation. So if we're going to complete this in relation to the individual young person, what do we know about their individual situation? We may say, okay, they've currently been excluded from school and they're currently on an order to youth offending service for robbery. So that we know that about them as an individual. Now, in terms of the family home, if we move down a row, situation in their family home is that, say, for this young person, they're living with both their parents and a younger sibling. We move down again to their peers. Their situation is that they have an extensive peer network, both online and offline, and some of those peers are involved in robbery offences. Similarly, we could say here, this young person is socially isolated, and that is the current situation in relation to their peer relationship. So this is about their situation in terms of friendships and relationships to date. Now, in relation to the situation for school, this young person is not currently in education, but they have previously been in a pupil referral unit where they were exposed to harmful sexual behaviours and violence between peers. And this is important because this is about the educational environment they have been in and are in terms of their situation. It's not about whether they've been excluded or not. We've already logged that in the first row in relation to the fact they are an excluded young person. This is about the situation in school in particular. And similarly, with the neighbourhood row at the bottom, their current situation in terms of the neighbourhood they're living in, they're living on a housing estate that has been identified as a hotspot for sexual offences by local analysts, particularly in relation to certain stairwells and kind of cloakroom cabinets next to those stairwells that professionals believe are being used for sexual offences. So that's the living situation in terms of the wider neighbourhood. We've already got the family situation logged earlier. So this gives us a contextual account of the young person's situation. And we have that discussion up front at the start of the meeting so that we get a sense of how that young person is living their life at the moment, beyond the issue of harmful sexual behaviour. The next column enables us to talk about the nature of the harmful sexual behaviour itself. So why has this referral been made for this meeting? So there has been an allegation in relation to what the individual young person has done, that they have raped a peer in the toilets of their school, and that they have filmed this, and that they have also used coercion in order to conduct the sexual offence. So that has been the allegation that's been made. For a number of reasons, there has been a decision not to charge the young person, mainly related to lack of evidence, but professionals who work with this young person and work with the young person who is alleging the assault are concerned enough that they believe something has happened and they want to intervene early to prevent anything like this happening again. But it's important to know exactly what the allegation is, given that we're talking about a rape, we're talking about coercive behaviours. We are thinking about an offence that sits more at the violent and abusive end of Hackett's continuum. Now, I want to think about the contextual dynamics in this young person's life that may be directly related to that harmful sexual behaviour. So, in terms of the family home, for this young person, no harmful sexual behaviour seems to have been displayed in the home environment towards siblings or between parents or carers or by older siblings. So as far as the family is concerned, there's no direct relation between what's happening in the family and the nature of the harmful sexual behaviour that's been displayed. Now, in relation to the peers of this young person, others in the young person's peer network also have no further actioned allegations related to harmful sexual behaviour, and 2 of the peers of this young person actually witnessed the rape, were there when it occurred. So peers are directly related to the nature of this behaviour. Now, the school also is associated to the nature of the behaviour being discussed, because the film that was taken was circulated amongst students and has been viewed by a number of them who have not raised concerns about it, and they've gone on to share it with others. So the student population and their response to the harmful sexual behaviour is important here and is normalising what has happened. And in terms of the neighbourhood, while this particular offence does not occur in the neighbourhood, practitioners know that this young person spends a lot of time in this housing estate, which has been identified as a harmful sexual behaviour hotspot, with the peers who also have allegations for harmful sexual behaviours. So in school as well as in the neighbourhood, he is in contexts where there are social norms at play which would facilitate behaviours that we would have concerns about. So these are the contexts which seem to be directly associated to the nature of the harmful sexual behaviour that this young person has displayed. So to date, this framework has now given us a bit of a sense of the situation the young person is in and the nature of the behaviours that they have displayed. It's now important to go on and think about the vulnerability, risk and resilience factors that may be aggravating or protecting against these behaviours occurring in the future. Now let's think about vulnerabilities and risks first. So I'm not going to go through all of these in the way that I have done for the previous columns, but I'll give you some examples. So in terms of the individual vulnerabilities related to this young person, they do have a learning difficulty, although this has not been formally given any kind of formal diagnosis. And they are also identified as a young person who follows the lead of others. So they can be easily influenced into a range of behaviours. So they're quite vulnerable in that regard. If we think about vulnerabilities in their peer group, a number of their peers have been victimised before, mainly experienced robbery in the local area. So while we know that they are have got allegations in relation to harmful sexual behaviour, we also know that this is a group of young people who have experiences themselves of victimisation. And if we think about, for example, vulnerabilities at school, well, this is a school that he was attending before he was excluded, where the quality of sex and relationships education was quite poor, and where there was a number of areas in the school that were unsupervised at times of day, and this was where the alleged sexual offence occurred. So there are particular vulnerabilities in relation to this individual young person, but also in relation to the context in which he's spending his time, which provided the foundations for the offence to occur. Now, in relation to risk factors, if we think about these, in this case, the young person has used violence in the past, physical violence, and they also have displayed harmful attitudes towards women and girls and issues of consent. So these are persisting risks that may be associated to future behaviours of concern. In relation to the neighbourhood the young person lives in, well, this is a locality that they share with the person who is alleging the rape, and threats have now been made to that young person on the street for the allegation that she has made. So there are simmering tensions in the local neighbourhood which are really normalising and encouraging the behaviour of concern, because they're blaming the victim as opposed to the young person who has harmed them, or any wider factors that may have led to this incident occurring. And in terms of the school, we're also seeing victim blaming attitudes in the school, with other students blaming the young person who is alleging the rape. So we're seeing risks percolating contextually in this case, and there are some contextual vulnerabilities as well as those related to the individual young person themselves. So if we're going to move on and think about resilience factors and strengths related to this case, in terms of resilience, well, this young person is currently able to hold down a number of friendships and engage in a number of friendships despite the allegations made against them. They also managed to sustain educational placements despite their learning difficulties. It was the sexual offence and the allegations around the sexual offence that led to the exclusion. So this young person is well able to engage in educational activities and to sustain relationships, and these are important resilience factors in their life. If we're going to think about resilience factors in the family, for example, despite the increasing lack of control that the parents are experiencing over their young person, and the pull that peers are having over the decisions being made by this young person, the parents are well engaged with services, are seeking support and advice, and prior to escalating concerns about this young person's behaviour during secondary school, there were no concerns about the family. So these concerns have not emerged now that the young person's behaviour has changed. So they appear quite resilient in terms of their ability to hold firm as a unit in times of difficulty, and to maintain a desire to support their child. This also helps to identify strengths about the family, which is that it has the foundations of good attachments with the child that were formed during early childhood and can be built upon now, working with professionals to afford this young person response to their behaviours. So there's a lot of resilience factors and strengths within the family environment. In terms of the school did make the referral when concerns emerged about the harmful sexual behaviour offence, and they have been engaged in multi-agency meetings since that referral was made. So there is a merging relationship there with the multi-agency partnership that is a real strength that could be built upon. So we start to think about what it is in the contexts that this young person is spending their time in, and what it is about them as an individual that can be built upon to really maximise the kind of impact or effectiveness of any interventions that are put in place. Likewise, this peer network appears quite solid. So while the behaviours they're displaying are problematic, the fact that they are supportive of one another, come together on a regular basis, and particularly in light of the fact that a number of them have experienced victimisation themselves, this level of peer support is a potential strength that can be built upon and demonstrates their attempts at resilience in an area where they have been exposed to crime and robbery. So we can see some potential benefits to this peer group that could be maximised with an intervention. So we move on to the final columns in this table, which is about practice. So we've already discussed the young person's situation and the behaviour they've displayed. We've charted the vulnerability, risk, resilience and strengths factors of that young person, their family and wider context in which they spend their time. How do we now respond? Because the decision has been to not go down a criminal justice route with this case. So what are the other potential options in terms of response? Well, to date, this child has been excluded from school, and they are also already on a youth offending order for robbery offence. So that's the kind of intervention they've received as an individual. In terms of the family, once there were these concerns around harmful sexual behaviour, a referral was made to social care and a child and family assessment has been conducted of the family. In relation to peers, we know that a number of them are already being worked with by the Youth Offending Service for other violent offences, not harmful sexual behaviours. And then in terms of the neighbourhood, there's been an increased police presence at particular times of day because of these concerns about sexual offences occurring on the housing estate where the young person lives. So there are some responses logged to date, and importantly note that none have really been identified in the school environment. So we track what's happened to date against what's already been identified in this meeting and charted on the table. And we start to think about where we could be planning some interventions to address some of the factors that have been identified but not responded to date, and to build upon some of the resilience factors and strengths identified in the discussion. So let's think about peers, for example. Now, to date, peers have been worked with individually in related to individual violent offences that they have been involved in, but the collective involvement of the peer group in terms of normalising harmful sexual behaviours, but also their support of one another in relation to the victimisation they've experienced, has not been utilised or addressed. So we could suggest for the next steps is that this network be mapped more coherently to identify those who are leading, because we know a vulnerability around this young person is that they are followers. So who are they following? Who are the leaders in this group that may be causing more concern related to harmful sexual behaviour and other types of offending? And is there a potential to work for detached youth workers to work with the wider peer group, those who are following, to build on the fact that they are supportive of one another and that they've formed a unit together, but to address the impact that victimisation has had on them, and to begin to challenge harmful behaviours that they may hold as a group. So this may form part of a wider diversionary activity that they put in place with the young people, but that these interventions are then woven through that activity. So we could have a whole planned intervention around this wider peer group that is yet to be put in place. In terms of the school environment, we know that students are blaming a young person who has made the allegation for what has happened to them, which is aggravating the attitude of the individual young person of concern, because it's saying, yeah, you're right to have these attitudes and display these behaviours towards this young person. It was their fault, what happened in the toilets and so on and so forth. So it's not enough to just intervene with this individual child or even with their peer group. We need to think about the wider student body. So in terms of the planned intervention here, we could offer sex and relationships intervention into the school, some education intervention into that school, and maybe make some recommendations about the monitoring of toilets and other unsupervised areas, work with the school to start to identify other opportunities to disrupt situations where harmful sexual behaviour may be percolating. So these are interventions about the school environment itself. So we start to map out interventions that actually address the risk and vulnerability factors that have been identified and build on the strengths and the resilience factors that have been identified. This goes far beyond the one-to-one intervention and the child and family assessment that has been conducted in response to this case to date. And yes, we can try to integrate relationships work into the youth offending order that the young person is currently on in relation to their robbery. So we can do some more one-to-one work with them. And we might think about conducting an actual assessment in relation to their learning difficulty to see what the problems are, to see if that can an intervention in that regard may help address some of the behaviours the young person is displaying, their understanding of what they've done, or the fact that they tend to be following the lead of others and may have some need to develop other social skills. But all of that work will be amplified by planned interventions in that young person's peer group and school environment, which seem to be the things that have created a context conducive to the harmful sexual behaviours occurring in the first place. So I hope you've seen, by working through this table with me, that it is important throughout the process to note the difference between individual and contextual factors. So a young person not attending education, this is a vulnerability associated to them as an individual rather than about their school. Whereas if a young person has been exposed to bullying at school and this bullying is triggering their non-attendance at school, for example, then the bullying issue is about the school environment more generally, and that would go in the row about schools and would be logged there. So it is really important to think these things through quite carefully, because it will have an impact on the intervention that you then put in place at the end. If non-attendance in relation to the individual is not about what's happening in the school environment, then we'd probably need to do some one-to-one work with the young person to identify why they're not attending. But if the non-attendance is related to bullying, then the response and the planned intervention should probably try to work with the school to address the bullying behaviours that are triggering the non-attendance. And the fact that the school is already engaged with the local authority and has made a referral in relation to their concerns is a strength that could be built upon in order to make this offer around an intervention relating to bullying. People have also asked us about the differences between risks and vulnerabilities when completing this table, and so we just want to flag this with you here in case you have a similar question. We would really explain them as follows. Vulnerabilities are factors in an individual, family or wider contextual spaces that exist beyond the issue in question. So they are not about the harmful sexual behaviour, but they may exacerbate the risks associated to it. So in the case we looked at, a young person has a learning disability. This is an individual vulnerability, which may mean that they can be easily manipulated or coerced by other peers into engaging in harmful behaviours, or they may struggle with mainstream lessons around sex and relationships education and therefore not benefit from them. So it's a vulnerability, but there'll be plenty of young people with learning difficulties that don't display harmful sexual behaviours. So it's not a risk directly related to this issue, but it's something to be mindful of. Likewise, a young person might be living in a home where they've been exposed to domestic abuse. Now that's a vulnerability factor for them and for the home. It would be a vulnerability factor in the home because it may prevent the home environment from being as protective as it could be or as engaged as it could be in the service response, and it may have exposed a young person to harmful attitudes earlier in their life in relation to relationships or consent or intimacy and so on and so forth. Whereas risks, we were considering for this template to be about factors directly associated to the behaviours of concern. So a young person holds harmful attitudes towards women and girls, and this has driven some of their behaviour. This is a risk that would need to be addressed in order for that behaviour to be interrupted. Or a young person has been exposed to problematic attitudes or sexual behaviours by an older sibling at home or by their peers, etc. These would be risks directly associated to the behaviour that they then display. These would be risks rather than vulnerability. So we would split them like that. Now, there are some factors that can be both a risk and a vulnerability. The most classic one would be a child going missing. In going missing, they may be more vulnerable to being groomed or coerced into harmful sexual behaviours by the people they spend their time with when they are missing, people they encounter on the street, for example. Or they may be going missing as a result of the behaviours that they're involved in, and therefore the missing behaviour has occurred as a consequence and are directly associated to the behaviours they're displaying rather than something that's happened prior to the behaviours starting. So there are some things that can straddle both the vulnerability and risk factor binary, and that's fine. It's fine to record them in both if that's what they are, but that is how we would distinguish them. So we hope you found this tutorial a helpful introduction into the use of this template. If you do plan to use it in your local area, do let us know and provide us with any feedback on its use. 4 areas have already used it to date, and some are suggesting that they will use it to minute meetings that they hold about vulnerable adolescents in general, including young people affected by sexual exploitation or serious youth violence, rather than just reserve it as an approach that they take to discussing young people who display harmful sexual behaviours. So however you choose to use this table, please do keep us updated. And particularly let us know if any revisions would be helpful, because this is a process that we are working through to provide people with as many resources as possible to develop their local contextual responses to children and young people who display concerning behaviours or who are in need of protection. Thank you very much.